Lovely. Thank you very much, Neil, and good evening to everybody. A very warm welcome. Whilst I was very disappointed earlier in the year to not be able to host the lecture face-to-face, I'm absolutely thrilled that we've been able to bring you now the Dennis Rooke lecture as part of the annual conference. So despite my presidential year having finished back in June, when I handed the reins over to the president, now Duncan Wong, I'm delighted to have that opportunity to host the event tonight. Firstly, a few words about Sir Dennis Rooke. Sir Dennis Rooke's greatest technical achievement and lasting legacy was to build the UK's gas distribution network and you really unite the gas industry, making domestic gas a cheap and convenient fuel source for millions of people. He acquired an awesome reputation as the Lion of British Gas in the 1980s, as the Conservative government threatened to break up the British Gas Corporation during privatisation. His devoted employees saw him as the defender of his gas company against the most determined of politicians. Famously, he said, "Whilst I have to deal with politicians, that does not mean I have to like them." Lord Lawson of Labour, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, reveals in his memoirs a certain awe of Sir Dennis, having been on the receiving end of his championing of the gas industry, describing him as a large, craggy, overbearing man, treating ministers and officials alike with a mixture of mistrust, dislike and contempt. So, quite a formidable character. So since retiring from British Gas, Sir Denis devoted his talent and determination to engineering education, becoming Chancellor of Loughborough University and then becoming President of the Royal Academy of Engineering. And in that role, he drove the development of its education programmes, and he also served on many national advisory committees on both energy policy and education. He was awarded a CBE in 1970 and in 1977. For his service to the gas industry. And he won the Academy's Prince Philip Medal for Engineering Achievement, the James Watt International Medal from the IMechE, George Davis Medal from the IGEM, and our own Golden Birmingham medals from IGEM ourselves. He was, of course, an outstanding and fondly remembered president of IGEM. So with that biography in mind, I can only be delighted that our speaker this evening, Chris Stark, has agreed to be with us and share his presentation with our online audience. This evening's lecture is entitled Molecules and Electrons, the Net Zero Conundrum. Chris is the Chief Executive of the UK Committee on Climate Change, the CCC, the public body tasked with Climate Change Act, to be the independent authority on tackling climate change. Chris leads a team of analysts and specialists, offering expert insight into the challenges of reducing the UK's emissions and adapting to climate change. Chris led the CCC's work in 2019 to recommend a new net zero target for the UK, which has now been brought into law. He speaks regularly on the transition to a net zero economy and the need to confront climate change with urgency. Chris has got widespread experience in government. He has designed economic policy in Whitehall, including HM Treasury, and the former Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. He was previously Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government, leading the development of the Scottish energy and climate strategies. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Perhaps, Anthony, you could give me a thumbs up just to show you can hear me, and then I can begin. Wonderful.
All good.
Very good. Well, look, let me say thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you tonight. These are not the circumstances under which I hoped I would be delivering this lecture. So you join me in my bedroom here in Glasgow, where I have been for the last 6 months in what has been the strangest period of my career. And this makes it all the stranger. So I was absolutely delighted when Neil approached me before the pandemic, remember those days, to ask if I'd deliver this lecture. And I said yes immediately. I must say, before I begin, I have really enjoyed reading about the formidable Dennis Rooke. he would no doubt be very suspicious of me, and he would probably be quite right to be suspicious of me. He was very much a man of science and above all an engineer from what I can glean. And these are things that I have to say I don't pretend to be. I look to the experts around me to provide those things, including you. And tonight we're going to be talking a lot about the need for expertise to be brought to this challenge of reaching net zero overall. I was struck as I read about Denis's life, how much he championed the consumer, the real people. So those who really stood to benefit from low-priced, very convenient, very safe natural gas. And it's on those issues where I feel much more of an affinity with Sir Denis. My own career has not centred on environmental issues really until this job. I have worked mainly on the economy, mainly in Whitehall, also in Scotland where I am today. My interest is really in the economic and the social implications of the transition ahead of us. By way of introduction, I'm absolutely certain that achieving net zero is necessary. I'm equally certain that it can be achieved, and much of the work that we've done in the Committee on Climate Change has been about setting out the pragmatic steps that will be necessary to reach net zero. I'll be talking a lot about those tonight. But I am most certain of all that we have to achieve this national goal in such a way that we protect those who can least afford the cost. And along the way, I think the other part of this story is this fair transition that's ahead of us that we must create is also about not just protecting people from cost, but also creating new economic opportunities, new jobs as we tackle the challenge, just as Sir Denis, I'm sure, would want us to. I don't think there's anything more exciting than that. So the net zero goal has provided us with the catalyst to do all this stuff. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about the implications of net zero. I'm going to start by discussing briefly the implications of climate change itself, tell you more about the motivation for net zero, the target, then go into the good stuff. I'm going to have a look at the UK's system challenge. It is a system challenge of meeting net zero by 2050 at the latest. You will hopefully see why the title of this lecture is Molecules and Electrons, and hopefully you will agree that is a suitable framing for the lecture tonight. And I will end on a bit of a deep dive on the issues on how we heat homes in the future and buildings in this net zero world that we are now signed up to. So what might we expect along the way as we are guided by government and by industry over the journey ahead? So if we move on to the next slide, please. So let's, while we're on this slide, let's begin with a bit of background on climate change itself. A word before that on me and on my organisation. The CCC, as we have come to be known, the Committee on Climate Change, is a funny old body. We're not part of government. I resigned as a civil servant to take the role that I have now. We are tasked with providing independent technical advice on the achievement of the targets that Parliament has set in the Climate Change Act. Now, we do that in a way that has been developed over the last 12 years since we came into existence in 2008. And we do that broadly by gathering the best possible information we can on the steps that can abate carbon in the economy. We bring that together and we hire as best we can the best possible analysts to process that information, to model it, and then to provide government and Parliament with our best possible assessment of the steps that lie ahead for the UK to meet the targets that Parliament has set for them. Everything we do is published. We try to be as transparent as possible about the basis of our recommendations and our modelling. So tonight, everything I will discuss is drawn from that evidence base that we have gathered in the CCC. Some of the stuff I will talk about tonight we haven't published yet, but it's destined for a major report that we have planned at the end of the year. Again, I'll talk about that in just a second. That report, though, is going to be such an important moment because it's the next of the UK's carbon budgets. So for those of you who follow this, the UK has a long-term goal, which is now a net zero goal. So that means the equivalent of 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 at the latest. And there are a set of interim targets, which we call the carbon budgets, which take us on the glide path to that new goal. We, this year, will offer our advice, as we're required to by the Act, on the 6th carbon budget, which takes us out to the mid-2030s. And the importance of that is that this will be the first of the carbon budgets that will have been set since the long-term goal was reset to net zero. And therefore, this is the thing that will determine the shape of the chart. So the glide path from where we are today to net zero by 2050 And we are very conscious of that. This is probably the last of the carbon budgets. It runs out to 2037. This is the last of the carbon budgets, therefore, that will really matter in determining the shape of that chart over time. One of the big factors in that is the story of what we do about natural gas and what we do about heat in the UK. Now, I'm going to come on to those issues later, and much of what we'll talk about is informed by the latest work we've been doing for the 6th carbon budget. But to begin, I want to start talking about the global issues. And since I have a longer time tonight, I am going to start with these global issues, and I'm going to talk about climate change itself. So let's move on to the next slide. And I find this just a fascinating little piece of data that this looks at. This is really the only science I'm going to bring you tonight. This looks at the historical record of how much carbon dioxide there is in our atmosphere. Now, we know quite a lot about that, and the only bit of science really that you need to know is that there is a near linear relationship between the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and the temperature on the planet. And the reason for that is that it is a greenhouse gas, and there's a mixture of other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere too, which all have similar properties. That is that as the sun shines on the planet, heat is reflected back from the surface, and these molecules trap some of that heat and effectively warm the planet more than would be possible if it wasn't coated in that blanket of greenhouse gases. Now, interesting with carbon dioxide is that we have a very good record going back to 1958 and even before that of the CO2 that we have in our atmosphere. This is showing you from 1958 onwards the sample from the station that there is in Hawaii that's been every day making that assessment of how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere. And you see that kind of thick black line there, which has been on the way up now since 1958. We can also go back further. What I'm showing you here is ice core data. So we can look at we can take cores from the poles, the polar ice caps, and we can look at the bubbles in those ice cores, and we can tell what the concentration of CO2 was like in the past. And this shows you from 1700 till September the 20th, 2020, so just a few days ago. And I think it shows you something. It shows you that there's something that's been happening over time. But if we go on to the next slide, this is a far more interesting chart, I think. And just roll on one more slide, if you will. And you'll see that this is showing you something I think absolutely fascinating and slightly horrifying. This is 800,000 years of data from those ice cores. And what you see is this natural carbon cycle over time. So remember, this is actual sample data from the air trapped in those ice cores. And you can see that there is indeed a natural carbon cycle. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does vary over time. And with it, you will see these periods of cold and warm that the planet has always had. But that line on the right of the chart there is not the edge of the chart. It is an actual, it is the trend. And that red line is effectively what we have done in the very recent history since we started burning fossil fuels. And it is really at unprecedented levels now. We are at a point today that the planet has not really been at, we think, for several million years. And several million years ago, when we had this kind of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, the planet was much, much warmer than it is today. So we didn't have much at all by way of ice at the poles. Sea levels were much, much, much higher than they are today. It was a very, very different world several million years ago. That's where we are today. And with that comes some pretty big changes to our climate and our planetary systems and weather. So on to the next slide, please. And the impact of that line that you saw there, which is particularly the product of the last 50 years, is quite sharp. Most commentators recently have been talking about the extreme weather events that we've been seeing around the world. So things like droughts, forest fires, heat waves. And it is true that we are seeing this more extreme weather around the world, and more frequently we are seeing these extreme weather events. That is climate change, and it is often thought to be a kind of global issue somewhere else, I think, in some of the coverage of this. But it's not, it's with us here today. So this is a kind of interesting picture of what's been happening here in the UK. And here in the UK, we're seeing climate change happening today as well. It is not a foreign issue. It's not just happening somewhere else. We are getting warmer in the UK too, and it is happening quickly. And it's really the quickness with which these changes that are happening that should concern us most. Around the world, we are now seeing what you might think of as long tail events. That is, events that used to be quite unlikely, and are now made much more likely by higher temperatures. There is more energy in the world's climate systems now. And that is something that should concern us. Here in the UK, we're experiencing it, as you can see here, particularly in the southeast. So it's not uncommon now for temperatures above 35 degrees centigrade in this country. By the end of this century, even places where I am in the frozen north, we think will quite commonly exceed 30 degrees centigrade each year. The UK's record temperature is 38.7 in Cambridge, which was set in 2019. I think it's just a matter of time now before we reach the 40 degrees centigrade threshold. And this is the kind of change that comes with 1 degree of warming. So that chart I showed you earlier with the very sharp line that I put a red ring around, that equates to 1 degree centigrade of warming above where we were prior to us starting to use fossil fuels for industry and prior to the Industrial Revolution. And that has caused the changes that we are now seeing around the world and here in the UK. These are very troubling things, but I'm afraid more of it is yet to come. So we move to the next slide. And in the UK, further change is inevitable. So that is baked in, I'm afraid. The brown blob that you see there tries to explain some of that. We have had 1 degree of warming, thereabouts, and we think that around another 0.5 degrees of warming is inevitable by mid-century. Now, that is an enormous shift in planetary history. We have not seen warming that quickly, really ever. And it's a very troubling thing overall. We are not well adapted to changes that happen that quickly. So we've got big changes potentially in the natural world that will come with warming of that scale here in the UK, and especially in some other places in the world that may experience that warming more in more extreme ways. So the poles will warm more quickly than we will in the UK, for example. But the more important thing is that we're not adapted here in the real life either, in the real economy. So in particular, our buildings aren't poorly adapted for the temperature increases that we will see inevitably. And that is something that will factor into some of the issues that we'll discuss later in this lecture. The most optimistic take on where we are heading really is all about the path of global emissions overall. So if we add up those global commitments today, that's really what matters when it comes to the amount of climate change that we will see in the future, the amount of global warming that we'll see in the future. Optimistically, if we add up the global commitments that we have today, we're on course for somewhere between 3 degrees and 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That is really quite troubling. It's quite difficult to describe those impacts. It's pretty devastating. Particularly 4 degrees of warming is not something that we really can easily accommodate and adapt to. They will be devastating for some parts of the world, probably not in the UK, but there will be fundamental impacts to the UK too. And it is not an outcome I would suggest to you all that we wish to see. So for the remainder of this lecture, we're going to talk about what we can actually do about that. So what can we do about this change, some of which is inevitable, most of which is not. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is the implication in emissions terms of the agreement that was reached in Paris 5 years ago. Now, this takes just a little bit of explanation. The Paris Agreement, which many of you will have heard of, is an agreement about temperature. So it was an accord reached by every country in the world, including notably the United States, who has the intention under Donald Trump to remove itself from the accord at the end of this year. But at the moment, every country in the world has signed up to the Paris Accord. And the Paris Accord says that we will try to limit future warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade with best efforts for 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, I mentioned about 0.5 degrees centigrade of warming is already baked in above the one that we have. So we are right on the margins of that 1.5 degree margin, that target already. Now, we can translate those temperature goals into emissions pathways, and that's what I'm showing you here. The red line is the median of the emissions pathways that would get us to the 1.5 degrees C target at 50% probability. The blue line is 2 degrees C at 66% probability. And what's interesting about that, if we move to the next slide, is that what this implies is that the world must reach net zero by 2070. Just flick back, thank you. Must in the 2070s. And the UK has signed up to a target ahead of that global goal in 2050. Now, when we look at that chart, what this shows you more than anything is the need for us to change quite rapidly the course of emissions. So the green line is the historical one. What we need to meet the goals that were set in Paris is in effect a handbrake turn over the course of the 2020s in emissions. Just flick on to the next slide, thank you, and you'll see the UK goal there, beg your pardon. Now, that is possible. One of the ways that I think it is possible is that we can have a better grip on what the global strategy is overall, and that's what I'm trying to show you here. This is something we produced last year. This shows you emissions per capita in the 4 main regions of the world economy. So the developed regions, which of course the UK is a part, think of that as the kind of G20 region, G20 countries, China, India, and the developing regions. So this is what would need to happen on an illustrative basis for us to meet the Paris Agreement per capita emissions. And what this shows you is this kind of leadership that is implied by the Paris Agreement from the G20 rich developed economies, where we see sharper falls from a high base in per capita emissions than in the other regions. So look at, you can see the red line on that chart, which moves from a position where we are, as developing economies, the highest per capita emitters, where we go through the other lines on that chart to in the 2040s reaching net zero CO2, 2040s, 2050s. China is a very interesting one. China last night announced that they would commit to a transition not a million miles from that blue line. And I must say, when we put this analysis together last year, I did not expect that we would be having that kind of discussion. So I am optimistic that this is indeed the kind of transition that lies ahead of us for the global economy. I'm optimistic because not just because China is willing to make this commitment, not just because the UK is willing to make this kind of commitment, not just because the EU is willing to make this kind of commitment. I'm optimistic because there are enormous changes occurring right now in the global economy that are going to drive this to happen, I think, much more rapidly than we think. So we move to the next slide, thank you. And this is my last kind of global take on the issues. And just take some time to look at this. Now, this is looking at just how we generate electricity, but electricity is a very important part of the transition for the global economy. The overall strategy is if we can decarbonize the production of electricity, then we can electrify the economy. The end use can be turned to electricity as its basis more and more for transport, for heat, as we'll discuss, for cooling as well. If we can do that, then that's a very good way of integrating an integrated way of decarbonising the whole economy. And this is one of the charts that I return to regularly, just updated. What this shows you is that the alternatives to fossil fuels for producing electricity are becoming cheaper and cheaper. The grey bands on this chart are the bands of fossil fuel prices for producing electricity, and the coloured lines on that chart show you how the price has changed of these alternatives, the renewable alternatives there. Nuclear would be on this chart too. It'd be a more expensive version, a more expensive way of generating electricity, although it does have important system benefits. And what this tells me is we are right on the cusp of an amazing moment when it will straightforwardly be the cheapest decision to move to low carbon generation. And I think that is going to drive a huge pace of change in all sorts of ways that we haven't really considered yet. Of course, it will make a big change in the energy sector, but I think you're seeing right now, today almost, the pace of change that will happen in the automotive sector with that, the enormous disruptions that are coming from electric vehicles, which will be drawing on that cheap power in the future, of course. And this can extend into all sorts of other areas. And that's really what I want to talk about, is that very optimistic take, which I think increasingly is the realistic take. So now let's talk about the UK, and let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I really want to get down to business. That was the global story, the backdrop to what I'm now going to talk about for the remainder of this lecture, which is about what we do here in the UK. The global stuff is important, but I think it is slightly abstract. So what I really want to be able to tell you a bit about today is our view, at least, of how net zero will be achieved in the UK and the kind of integrated steps overall that we need to take. So the next slide, thanks. So just a quick sense check before we dive in on all this. Here in the UK, the target that we have for net zero is about the emissions that we produce within the UK's borders. There's another discussion for an even longer lecture about our broader carbon footprint, which includes all the things that we are responsible for outside of our borders. But the target is about the emissions produced here in the UK. And on that basis, emissions have been falling pretty consistently since 1990. I've just shown you one way of showing that in these two charts here, which show you the emissions per sector. Now, we've had the Climate Change Act since 2008, which set the old goal of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 to 2050. Last year, we upped the target to net zero on the advice of my committee. And that is an enormous challenge, but it's worthwhile just grounding ourselves in a bit of the history here. Since the Climate Change Act in 2008, emissions have fallen. If we go back to 1990, emissions have fallen back since 1992, and there are three things behind that change. First is the composition of the UK economy, and crucially what's happening with industry. Some heavy industry was offshored in the early part of this transition. Actually, not nearly as much as many people think. Most of the heavy industry closures happened before 1990. Actually, over this period, the GVA of British industry has grown over that period. So although we have done some moving of industry offshore, that's not one of the main drivers overall. So industry composition, though, has helped. We have become more dominated by the service sector, which is, of course, typically less carbon intensive. We are more energy efficient. So we are using energy far more efficiently than we did in Dennis Rooke's time. And the last of these big drivers of that overall change over the last few years has been the power sector. And that's the real triumph, I think, of UK policy since the UK Climate Change Act came into being in 2008. It is UK policies that have been driving us to a much more decarbonised power sector. Increasingly, we have not just been closing coal-fired power plants, that's been the bedrock of those emission falls, but replacing them with bigger and bigger scale low carbon generation. Most notably now, offshore wind. That is a great story, but I'm afraid we are not going to be able to rely on power emissions to prop up that UK emission reduction overall for very much longer. We're going to need to see progress on the other lines on those charts in every other sector. And that is a very different challenge to shutting just a few power stations. Shutting power stations is a very centrally planned thing to do. It's a much more atomized process to decarbonize the end use of fossil fuels in all those other sectors. It is a messy old business, decarbonizing all the end uses of energy. It implies changes to lifestyles, changes to industries, changes to travel, changes to what we consume, changes, of course, to policy to drive all of that. So let's have a look at that, and let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is the task before us, in one way of illustrating it, at least. This is emissions in the UK in 2019, again by sector, and you can see there that they're sitting around about 500 megatons. Roll on to the next slide, please, and this gives you a sense of what must be done to get to net zero. So this is what we said last year would be necessary to get to net zero by 2050. What this shows you is really a kind of quite a simple thing to say at the outset. It's the near complete elimination of greenhouse gas emissions in most sectors. So that's the chart in the middle there, the bar in the middle. There are only tiny emissions, tiny numbers of emissions, tiny amounts of emissions left in transport, in power, in waste, and as we'll discuss in depth later, in buildings. And these are the set of sectors where we think it is now possible to get to actual zero emissions or thereabouts. And for those sectors that continue to have emissions in 2050, and there are two in particular, which is farming or agriculture and aviation, then we need to accept we can reduce those as much as we can, but then accept that there will need to be something on the other side of the ledger, and that is greenhouse gas removals, either natural greenhouse gas removals, so growing lots of trees, the carbon sinks, or engineered removals, so finding technological approaches to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Overall, that has to add up to zero. That's the challenge. That's the net bit. That's net zero overall. So what I'd like to do today, again, because I have longer, is to take you through how that challenge might be achieved. And this is a highly stylized assessment of what I think is necessary. But you'll see, I hope, the importance of molecules and electrons in this story overall. So I'm going to rattle through some slides. So next slide, thank you. So let's first of all just pause and say what I'm going to show you here is something that looks at energy supply, which looks at energy use, and which looks at how we use land. So next bit of the slide, please. So where we are today, I'm just going to start with the power sector. Today, about half of the electricity that we are producing is low carbon. That comes from a mixture of nuclear and renewables. The first thing we've got to do is have a strategy for decarbonising all of that. So next, roll that on one, thank you. But that's not enough. That's not enough electricity overall. So we can roll on just a second. We also have to think about the end use for energy, and it's here where we really see the challenge. So what I'm showing you here is the top section in buildings, and roughly this is to scale. This is again highly stylized, but the top section is buildings. Next we have surface transport. Beneath that we've got heavy transport, so also farm machinery and shipping. And beneath that we have industry. Next slide, thanks. So the first step is to double, we think, at least the size of the power system, because we're going to need a lot of it. And once we've done that, next slide, thanks, we will be able to electrify large parts of those end uses that I talked about. Now, that's a very good strategy for many, many places, including in the built environment. So alternative to using fossil fueled heat is electrified heat, and we'll talk about that later. Especially useful thing to do in surface transport. We're seeing more and more the interest in decarbonising surface transport with electric vehicles. There is some potential to electrify heavier forms of transport, heavy goods, and some potential to electrify industry, but that is not enough. So we need something else over and above that. So next slide, thank you. So now we need to look to a fuel that we can use in a net zero future. So it's something that we can use either as as a combustion agent or something that we can use in the production of electricity, perhaps. And that's hydrogen. Now we do produce some hydrogen at the moment, relatively small amounts. We first of all have to find a strategy for greening that hydrogen. So next slide, thank you. And then we need to think about how we scale that up. And I think when we look at the challenges that we face in the economy, this is the biggest one. So the next slide, thank you. We need to scale that hydrogen production up at least tenfold, probably more than that. And then we have a fuel that we can use in those end uses as a complement to electrification. So next slide, thank you. This just gives you a sense of where we think it can be used. It can be used in power production itself as a replacement for natural gas. It can be used in the home to heat. It may have a role in surface transport, but we think increasingly battery electric is going to be the way to decarbonize light transport. But it certainly has a role in heavier forms of transport, and it certainly has a role in industry. It's really the only option for replacing fossil fuels for some industrial processes. But that is not enough either. So next slide, thank you. We also need to think about, particularly for industry, whether we continue to use fossil fuels but capture that carbon. That's not a zero carbon process, but we can do that. So we need to build that facility, and we have a lot of storage facility in the UK, particularly in the North Sea. We build the infrastructure to take that carbon and secure it permanently in geological storage where there used to be oil and gas offshore. But that is not enough either. If we roll on to the next slide, thank you. There are some areas where we don't think it is possible to fully decarbonise, and most notably that is in agriculture, but also in aviation. And for those remaining residual emissions, we have to have something on the negative side of the lecture, as I mentioned before, and that is crucially what we do with land. So next slide, thank you. So we need to plant a lot of trees. Next slide, thank you. But not a lot more than that. So that was roughly what we were planting. This is what we need to plant at scale to get to that kind of net zero goal that we painted for you last year. Next slide, thank you. And there is also the opportunity to use land in a different way so that we create crops for energy. And if we do all of that, next slide, thank you, we also have the opportunity of growing and using those biocrops in the energy processes and capturing the carbon, and that is what we call bioenergy with CCS, and it has a big role potentially in the future if we can build the infrastructure for it. And the very last step on this highly stylized Janet and John does net zero presentation is that we can also think about reducing our demand, next slide, thank you, for those residual emissions, so aviation and meat production. So that involves changes in lifestyle that will help in this transition overall. So eating less red meat, for example, will help because we'll have more land available for the natural carbon sequestration and fewer emissions. Flying less means we'll be using jet fuel less, and we have therefore less to set off with offsets. Now, that is my very quick take on what the UK could do to get to net zero. Now, note that that is a picture of what the world looks like in 2050. rather than the journey to it. And that really is the challenge, is what does the change look like over time? If you accept for a second that that is one route to achieving net zero, what really matters is the transition. And really that's for my committee where we are turning next. And we'll get onto the really important task of how you engineer that kind of transition overall. So just a quick take on that at the next slide, thank you. Let's just look at the kind of ramp up rates that would be necessary to meet that kind of goal. These are numbers that are still moving, but I've drawn from some unpublished work that we've got on the implications of net zero for electricity demand there. I mentioned it was a big scale up, and you can see here the transition. So we're talking about easily doubling the size of the electricity system, on some scenarios much more than that, even tripling the size of the electricity system to satisfy that demand for electricity in the future. The next slide, thank you. We're also talking about growing enormously the amount of hydrogen that is produced. From almost zero at the moment. There is hydrogen being produced, but we need to scale it up by at least a factor of 10. Vast new low carbon hydrogen industry needs to be created from almost nothing at the moment. Hugely exciting, so that we can satisfy those end uses. And that is a chicken and egg problem. We don't just have to kind of pump prime it so the supply is there, we also have to build the demand alongside it. And alongside that, next slide, thank you.
Oh, hello.
We can also see how electricity and how gas demand reduces over that time. Now, note that gas demand doesn't get to absolute zero. In the future, we are still using we're still using it, but with carbon capture and storage on the power and hydrogen production in 2050. Oil demand also reduces significantly. I'm not showing you that here. Aviation is really the only main user of oil by 2050. Next slide, thank you. So it's tempting in these presentations to view it all as a technical thing, and it is not. Actually, the critical issue is that it is not just a technical challenge overall, it is a social challenge. And there is nothing more important to the society that we live in than how we heat our homes and our buildings. But I just want to pause on this before I go into that discussion, just to look at this. This is something that we did quite late on in our analysis of net zero last year. We stood back from it just to say, hang on, let's just look. How much of this involves the kind of technological shift only that we've seen to decarbonize power to date? So that kind of idea that something is happening somewhere else. And it's true that a lot of the progress that we need to make to get to net zero involves straightforwardly changing technologies. But most of the emissions reduction that we think is necessary to get to net zero by 2050 at the latest involves some measure of behaviour change alongside that. And that is a really important insight because it's the kind of things that we haven't really seen yet. As I mentioned before, most people are happy enough to see coal-fired power plants close because when they flick the switch on their kettle, it still works. Well, actually, what we think now is that for the next stage of this transition, we're going to have to properly engage people in understanding how lifestyles will change, how behaviours may change with that. I don't think there's anything to be afraid of here, but it is absolutely at the heart of the heat questions that we'll now go on to. How do we prepare the population of this country for the net zero transition ahead so that they're ready to heat their homes in a different way? Again, I do not think any of this is scary if we do that groundwork and prepare for it properly. So what I'd like to talk to you next about is our approach to decarbonising buildings, and just to give you a sense of what that would mean for the UK, again, using some of the analysis that we've been producing. So the next slide, thank you. So I mentioned decarbonised buildings is really at the heart of the kind of big challenge that we face. It is often described as the biggest problem that we face, and I am very keen tonight to say that that is not the case. It is certainly a challenge, but it's also an enormously exciting thing, and we've grabbed these kind of difficult and exciting transitions before, most notably with the decision to go for gas, which now supplies 85% of homes in the UK with the heat that we need. It is going to be a huge national mission to decarbonise the UK buildings. It is our view in the Committee on Climate Change that we can do this, that we can get to near as best zero emissions in the built environment. And I just want to give you a kind of few takes on how we can do that in the last section of this lecture tonight. So the next slide, thank you. So what I'd first like to try and do is to present to you an outline approach of how we might decarbonise UK buildings. I stress outline. At the moment, 20% of emissions that we see across the whole economy come from UK buildings. And it is one of the thorniest topics, as you know. We can segment the buildings into various categories to try and get a handle on an outline approach, which I'm going to do here. But know from please know from the outset, I'm not going to stop at this. This is quite a highly stylized approach. We will quickly get on to why this highly stylized approach is not sufficient and why we need a more realistic strategy alongside that. So more on that in a second, but this is going to give you a good grounding on certainly how we see things in the Committee on Climate Change. So let's start with this that you see here, the most easiest, in inverted commas, segment of this story, and that's new builds. And this makes me, it's kind of dry. I have a smile when I think about this particular part of my presentation. It is just over a year since I entered the lion's den at the last IGEM dinner after the last lecture, and very good lecture it was. But it was only a few weeks after we in the Committee on Climate Change had recommended that there should be a 2025 date at the latest, from which we said new builds should not have gas boilers installed. Now, I want to just briefly say something about that. That was, for us, last January, the product of some of the analysis that I'm going to talk to you about today. But it was, more importantly, it was just a straightforward cost and practicality issue. Very simply, it does not make sense for homeowners to have to incur the cost of retrofitting a low carbon heat solution in a new home a few years down the line, if we can avoid it. We assume generally in our analysis that boilers will last 18 years on average. And that therefore means if you have a 2050 target, we are approaching the critical moment to make to take a decision on what we do phasing out boilers in new builds. And that was what we said last January. And from my perspective, the good outcome was that the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, remember him, agreed with that analysis. And the Housing Secretary is now going about the task of implementing what he announced just a few weeks after we published that report, which is the Future Homes Standard, which will have the effect of ensuring that new builds are fit for the future, so sufficiently energy efficient in their fabric and their construction, but crucially also with low carbon heat solutions from the off. Now, we said 2025 in that report. We stand by that, but of course, the sooner we do this, the better. And I suppose, just as an opening point on this section, I think it's fascinating how much the debate has moved on since we said that very controversial thing last year. I feel, for discussion, of course, that the world has moved on a bit to thinking more strategically, more realistically, perhaps, about the challenge that's before us. But this is the easiest, again, inverted commas, of the segments that I will now move on to the next section. Next slide, thanks. So next is bringing in the existing buildings. And I want to start with the kind of real golden thread of the story remaining in this lecture, which is about the need to improve the energy efficiency of existing buildings. That underpins all of the progress that we need to make. The government's strategy overall is to upgrade the housing stock from an average of roughly EPC D at the moment to EPC C. We think that's about right as a bedrock strategy, but it will need to be completed over the next decade or so, and that is a huge challenge. It will be helped immensely by more pump priming of the supply chain with the big fiscal tools, and it was really pleasing to see the Chancellor's recent announcement of £2 billion for energy efficiency. But you know, that's a good start, but I suppose my question would be to the Chancellor, what comes next? So we've heard today that the budget has been cancelled, but there will be a statement about how he's going to support the economy. This is the kind of measure I would like to see extended so that we build proper supply chains for improving energy efficiency in the built environment. Next slide, thank you. And next we come to those existing buildings that are off the gas grid. Many of these are served by oil, of course, at the moment. Our modelling shows pretty consistently, whenever we've come to this, that most of these properties can be served by a heat pump, especially if there's an accompanying strategy to make those properties more energy efficient. There is room for some other alternatives, so resistive heating potentially could be in there too. That is something that we need to get cracking on now. There are lots of options here, but we don't need to wait in this segment for the more difficult strategic decisions to be made on the future of the national and local gas networks. Clearly, it's not just a question of rolling out heat pumps. There are all sorts of other things we can think about here. There is a role for bioenergy here. As I mentioned, there's also some resistive heating potentially in there too. Also hybrid heat pumps that could use a mixture. But there is, I'm afraid, a point, and I think we're at it, where we need to say, let's go, let's start on this, because we kind of know now roughly what the answers are. And we would say that that strategy of beginning must really happen in this decade ahead of us now. The government is going to have to regulate to cease the sale of oil boilers to give that strong signal before, I think, the end of this decade. On to the next slide. And lastly, this is the kind of most difficult segment of all, and by far the most interesting thing to talk about. And this is existing buildings which are on the gas grid. And here we face, the most questions about what lies ahead, the longest options list, of course, and the most scary announcements from ministers. And sadly, I didn't hear what Kwasi had to say, but this is going to be the issue that is on his desk in his red box, I hope, over the next few months. 85% of homes are heated from natural gas at the moment. And what I want to try and do tonight is encourage you to think about this challenge in a new way. So every one of those homes and those buildings is currently connected to a heat network of sorts. It happens to be the gas network. It is a very safe and extensive natural gas network. Every one of those homes and buildings is going to continue to be connected to a heat network in the future, but it's going to have to be a different sort of heat network to the one we have now, or we're going to fail to meet net zero. So we know that we need to decarbonise all of this. We just need to work out which heat network choices are going to be right for the buildings that we have to connect to. Now that, to me, is a fantastically interesting challenge. It is a classic engineering problem. We have a constrained problem with a range of engineering solutions. I have to say, when I was putting these slides together, I wondered what Sir Denis would have made of it if you'd put it to him in those terms. Broadly, there are 4 options for those future heat networks. There are the niche ones that you see there. So biomethane does have a role, but it's going to have to compete with all the other uses that we have for that bioproduct in the future, and there's going to be a lot of them. So we reckon that is probably only appropriate for about 5% of household heat in 2050. District heating is a bigger niche. We think it could be as high as 20% of all heat supplied through district heating by 2050. That will be heavily dependent, of course, on those areas where we can see concentrated demand. So in the cities, it's clearly possible. You look to Europe to see what could be done, I suppose, but nothing like the scale of district heating connections is occurring at the moment that we would need to get to that 20% figure. There is a great way to use waste heat here potentially, and especially if we can harness the heat from rivers with large-scale heat pumps. And that is, I think, a really exciting proposition, because most towns and cities do have a river course through them. Those, I would say, are the niche options here. That leaves us with the big boys, the big options: hydrogen and electricity. In electricity, heat pumps mainly, also some resistive heating. And it's really that I want to talk about next. And it's really that bit in the red box that you can see there. So let's go on then to the next section of this lecture, looking at what's in that red box. Now, I have worked on energy policy for over a decade now. Not as long as some, but longer than most. And in that time, one of the most revelatory moments I have had looking at these policy issues and analysing those issues was in the discussion that my committee had in 2018 about the numbers that I'm going to show you today. This is modelling that we commissioned a couple of years ago from Imperial College. Some of you may already be familiar with it. It looks at the system costs involved in 4 decarbonised heat pathways. And I'm going to just scroll through them before I give a bit of commentary on it. So if you just, next slide, thank you. And this shows you 2 routes through it. So the hydrogen for heating, so that's a world where we are using hydrogen to fully decarbonise the gas grid, and the electrification of where we're going to full electric pathway. The next slide, thank you. This is hybrid heat pumps. I think one of the most exciting developments in this discussion is a better understanding of what role they may have, where we use electrical heat pumps, not full sized, so we have the ability to use them for most of the time, but we can top up heat when we really need it using fossil fuels initially. We also have a run in the next slide looking at what would be there with hybrid heat pumps. Next slide, thanks. Hybrid heat pumps and hydrogen. And let's just roll on to the last of these slides. Great, and then I can give you a bit of commentary on it. So what this shows you is those 4 decarbonised heat pathways. I've added a 5th there, which is the cost compared with natural gas for heating, where we're applying a carbon price of £225 per tonne in line with Treasury investment guidance on how we should approach that carbon pricing. And it is just fascinating. The first thing you see is you can see obviously that the component parts of each of those pathways is very different. So the costs are made up of very different components. The costs are all within 10% of each other, which clearly is about the modelling that we've done, but I think is telling us something about the fact that cost overall is probably not the major determinant between these pathways. That's despite, as I said, the components of the system cost being very different in each pathway. Well, a few other things to take from this. The capital costs of heat pump installation and electricity grid upgrades are very significant in those pathways that are based on heat pumps. The costs of energy are considerably higher in the hydrogen scenario, however. The savings from reusing existing gas distribution grids, I think, are overstated in some of the commentary about hydrogen. Although it is helpful in limiting costs, it doesn't give the hydrogen scenario a particularly decisive advantage. A full electrification pathway would have demands from electricity from heating that are very peaky, if I can put it that way. So that creates challenge in having sufficient capacity to generate and deliver power on the coldest days. Our modelling suggests that we'd need backup electricity generation in excess of 100 gigawatts. That's about the size of today's electricity system, just to meet that electrified heat demand during peak periods. A pathway based on wholesale switchover of gas grids to hydrogen would imply a very large demand for hydrogen, obviously. The question really is how that would be supplied in a zero carbon way. And that becomes quite problematic at those kind of volumes. So looking at full transition to hydrogen creates those problems. And a hybrid heat pump pathway, which is based on methane as the residual gas, has lower cost than the other decarbonisation pathways. You can probably see that. But achieving the necessary decarbonisation for net zero relies on reducing gas demand to really, really low levels. And a substantial fraction of that could be met from biomethane. But basically, we don't think there's enough bioresource in 2050 to satisfy all of it. So interestingly, from all of that, a few things to take is that cost is probably not the primary determinant. It's probably more a set of questions about system and what kind of system we want in the future. The combination of hydrogen and electrification is, for me, a really exciting one. It offers the potential for full decarbonisation. It avoids some of the pitfalls and delivery challenges of achieving low emissions in the other pathways. And it is something I think we really need to talk about and be excited about, hence the title of this lecture. So on to the next slide, thank you. And let's just have a look at what this would imply for our future trajectory to fully decarbonised buildings. This is some brand new analysis, which I'll show you in a second, most of it unpublished. But before we go into that, some principles that might help guide the transition ahead of us. Firstly, as I've mentioned a few times, I see energy efficiency very much as the fundamental first step in decarbonising the built environment. If we don't do it, the scale of the problem just gets too big. And it's a very simple way of putting it. We've got to get cracking on it. There's no real reason to delay. Secondly, full hydrogen conversion is unwieldy, and I know there are many advocates of hydrogen, but just standing back from it, the kind of build rates that we would need to supply that hydrogen, I think point out how difficult it would be. So if we were going down the route of using gas reforming with CCS, we'd need between 100 and 150 gigawatts of capacity to do that. If we were going down the route of electrification, we'd need 300 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity if we're just using those electrolyzers to supply that hydrogen. So I think that tells you it is more sensible not to plan for full hydrogen scenario in the future, but instead a range of solutions. And for me, the kind of key point really, and if you remember nothing else from this lecture, I hope it is this one, that it is that with coordination, then we can have variance in the solutions by region. And I think that should depend on what resources are available locally, what infrastructure there is locally, and also local consent. I think there should be a choice for local communities in the transition ahead. System costs are not a major differentiator between our electrical or hydrogen future. So I think it is the public support that's likely to determine the shape of that pathway and that future for the UK. And we need to get away from thinking that there is just one answer for the UK into that much more interesting discussion, region by region, city by city. So drawing from all of that, so 5 strategic aims for policy. Firstly, to build public confidence over the 2020s. So the decade ahead really is a place where we have to do the demonstrations at scale that build the public confidence about the solutions that we have. That's solutions for hydrogen and also solutions that use electricity. We need to keep options open. We also need flexibility. So let's deploy heat pumps. Let's do heat networks at scale in the 2020s, and let's do hydrogen demonstration. And I've got a little slide for you later on that. I would like to see better quality information for households so that we have a meaningful discussion about public choice. One of the things I've been involved in this year has been the really excellent Climate Assembly, which has looked at the challenge of getting to net zero with 108 real representative citizens of the UK, chosen by their region, by their age, by their ethnicity, but also by their attitudes to climate change. And one of the really important things that came out from that was that there was broad support for the steps to decarbonise heat, but there was a real feeling that we needed to keep all the options on the table and that people needed information to make informed choice about it. And I could not agree more. So we have to make sure that we provide that. But we also have to make sure that we don't bias those choices by making rubbish policy choices now. So that's about really important message to Kwasi Kwarteng and all of the officials who are working on this. Think about, for example, the very complicated processes that are also often put in place to get access to the money that supports these technologies like heat pumps. And lastly, it seems obvious, but it's worth saying, we have to minimise costs and disruption. That was a big, strong message that came out of the Climate Assembly too. And that means opening the choices with local planning and local engagement. Now, I want to just go into this very last section, some analysis of what that would all imply. And this is hot off the press. So next slide, thank you. So first on energy efficiency. And I want you all to be excited about energy efficiency. This really is the bedrock of all the heat decarbonisation strategies overall. This just shows you in our latest modelling how cumulative energy efficiency measures grow over time. And the key message here is you can see the shape of that chart. We had to scale up pretty rapidly over the next 5 years to the point where we're doing this stuff at scale. The government has this ambition of EPC-C overall and we think broadly that is in the right place for energy efficiency. EPC-C by 2035. That would roughly get us in the right place for a smooth transition and low carbon heating. And we would see a lot of wider benefits to that too. So less drafty homes, health improvements that come with that too. Jobs, we'll come back to jobs. That would deliver about 10 to 20% in energy savings. That is pretty significant. Interestingly, we've done the numbers on this. So the total energy efficiency investment on that kind of projection is about £45 billion by 2035 and £55 billion by 2050. That actually compares quite well with what BEIS have published. So they've said between 35 and 65 billion. Now, we have been conservative here on our estimates of the impacts of upgrading efficiency of homes. We're using some evidence on how insulation measures currently work in homes. I think there is lots of room to improve that. But being conservative on this is a sensible basis to plan for our future heat system, even with those conservative assumptions about energy efficiency and the energy demand reduction that comes with that. It's worth doing. So that's the first plank, and I hope you can see that at home. Next slide, thanks. And this is a really interesting chart. This looks at the total investment requirements for zero carbon buildings. This is CapEx, CapEx only. And I think it tells a really clear story. You can actually see it. It's an image. You can see of how the transition needs to play out. So we start with the blue, the energy efficiency. You can see how that scales up over time. We also get cracking on off-grid heating. That's the orange part of that. Then from the mid-2020s, we start to tackle on-grid properties. And then the energy efficiency investment starts to tail off. Renovating buildings in the round at this kind of scale is a major investment program for this country. And of course, it comes with it that if you're going to make that kind of investment at national scale, there are some pretty strong economic benefits. So we also think we can direct that to have the most beneficial impact for the economy. So in particular, as we think about the recession that is ahead of us, why not try and do as much of this as possible now? So net investment costs over the 30 years to 2050 are somewhere between 250 and 300 billion. That is a lot, no doubt. But actually, that works out at less than £10,000 per home. Now, that's remarkable if you think about that as an investment figure. It is a big number which needs to be thought of very carefully. So we're going to have to think about the policies that will drive that, but also crucially how we spread that cost. But early investment will bring the biggest economic benefits because it will smooth the subsequent investment. It will support, crucially, jobs, and especially when we need those jobs now. And timely investment in energy efficiency also limits the subsequent investment costs in heat decarbonisation, of course. Next slide, thank you. We can also look at the OPEX impacts of that. So this is showing you the extra expenditure on low carbon heat that we will be making in yellow, and the reduced expenditure on energy more generally through energy efficiency. And those roughly cancel out. And what that means is that actually the OPEX impacts are less important than CAPEX in this transition ahead. This is going to be a capital intensive transition. So we need to look at the investment challenge. We've got to keep the cost of capital low. That's about having low risk policies in place so investors feel confident and can get cheap debt and cheap finance for that investment. Treasury needs to protect those who can least afford to make these investments. Very obviously, this is a huge issue. It is an achievable thing at roughly 10k per household, but it's going to need strong fiscal policies to spread that load. And I really, really hope the Treasury think about that, because to me, this is the kind of defining moment, I suppose, if we start to set those policies in train. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about hydrogen. Now, I'm really excited about hydrogen. I think it's a thing that must be kept in play. That means progressively building through the steps in the 2020s to build hydrogen up. It is magical thinking, though, to think that hydrogen is the only answer to domestic heat. There is simply too big a challenge in supplying all of it in a low carbon way. What is absolutely essential, though, is using hydrogen in decarbonising industry. We also need it as a drop-in replacement for transport fuels, for shipping, for example, as in its ammonia form, probably. So hydrogen across the whole economy is hugely important, and that includes in the domestic sense. It is not, however, a foregone conclusion that we're going to develop this kind of hydrogen economy, despite the very clear interest that we're seeing in it now. So we are recommending an integrated approach to that. So we need a hydrogen strategy that looks across domestic use for hydrogen, but also carbon capture and storage, also industry, also transport. Hydrogen is probably the right solution for domestic heat where there is local public consent for it, especially in those industrial communities that are going to be producing hydrogen. And I really think there's potential for it here, but we're going to need to grab it. So overall, if we do all of that, if I go on to the next slide, this just gives you a sense of how that might play out over time. So this is looking at the mix of low carbon heat technologies overall. And this is an example of how it all might come together. Now, we're going to be presenting something like this in our next major report, the 6th carbon budget at the end of the year. These numbers will continue to move, but it gives you a sense, I think, of really importantly, a mix, the importance of different technologies, those electrons and those molecules together. Also, the need for flexible systems for heating buildings. So a mix of heat pumps, heat networks, and crucially hybrid heat pumps gives us flexibility at a system level, and of course for households. And that's what helps minimize the costs of network reinforcement. It's also going to eliminate the need for some of the impractical insulation that might need to be installed in some of those hard to treat homes to improve their energy efficiency. So we need to value and enable that flexibility overall. And that's what cuts the costs overall. It also cuts carbon across the whole system. So we estimate that flexibility measures have potential, at least, to bring electricity system costs down by between £3 to £8 billion a year by 2030 and up to £16 billion a year by 2050. So just, some back of the fag packet calculations, if half of households with heat pumps were to preheat their homes, imagine they were on the kind of tariffs where there was a price signal for them to do that, that might save, let's say, $1 billion a year in system costs. That's an amazing thing that you get with that kind of flexible thing, with that mixture of low carbon heat solutions into the future. So the very last section then, last section for you tonight is how you bring this together as a strategy. So I want to try and bring this together in like a practical strategy, and this is the kind of message that I'll be giving to Kwasi Kwarteng. As practical strategy to decarbonise heating and to improve, of course, the energy efficiency of buildings in the UK, also to stimulate sufficient industry and consumer response to make it happen. I really hope Kwasi was in good form earlier, because this is the kind of strategy we'll need to see from him very soon. For me, there are 4 parts to this. So firstly, having clear direction. Secondly, making low carbon options more financially attractive. Thirdly, the measures that will enable the transition. And lastly, very obviously, getting on with it. So let's just go to the next slide. Thank you. And deal with the first of these. This is probably the most important of them. This is the area where we require, I think, leadership from government so that industry knows where to follow. The government needs to really set out the parameters of the transition ahead. And for me, that means 2 main things, which you can see here. First, on energy efficiency, we need to see a clear trajectory of obligations to make homes and buildings more energy efficient. On landlords first, but we also need a little more than that. One of the really interesting suggestions that we'll be making later this year, I think, is that mortgage providers should meet an average energy performance overall for their loan book. So just imagine that for a second. That would be the government saying that in the loans that are offered to properties, we can look at the average energy performance certification for those loans. And that would give, I think, the lenders more incentive to offer cheap loans and cheap finance for energy efficiency improvements, also for low carbon heat. That would really drive down the costs. We also need minimum standards over time that ratchet up. And one of the ways to do that is to have minimum standards that are met at the point of sale for owner occupiers. And that will really help drive up overall the energy efficiency of the building and the building stock over the next few decades. Second, and probably most important to this audience, is that we need to see the trajectory for low carbon heat from ministers. Our modelling suggests that all new heating systems must be low carbon. All sales must be low carbon from around the 2030 to 35 period, with a possible exception if we're installing those hydrogen ready boilers that we know are ready to come to the market in those areas where we've already decided that we will have a hydrogen grid. So that might be the only exception to that rule. And it's a straightforward modelling artifact. It comes out of the modelling, and it's a fairly obvious thing that we need to do, because otherwise we're not going to meet the 2050 target. So from 2030 to 35 onwards, all new investments for low carbon heat, for heat rather, every installation needs to be low carbon. Lastly, we also need some clear signals on the future of the gas grid from the government. And I think that is tied ultimately to the strategy for replacing unabated gas use in each region. And I think there is room there for us to be clear on where hydrogen is going to be used, and to do that as quickly as possible. So that's first to be a clear direction. Next slide, thank you. Second on the strategy list is the incentives picture. So Treasury is really in the lead here, and the top policy is about our attitude towards the cost of electricity for heat versus natural gas. So at the moment, there's an inbuilt penalty in the tax system to using electricity through VAT. It is cheaper, of course, to use natural gas than it is to use electricity, which is increasingly green. The policy costs of decarbonisation are also on the electricity bill. I think we need to look at that. So we need tariffs that value flexible demand. That's something we're already seeing. But really, this is about the Treasury looking at the incentives overall and ensuring that there is a balance there, so that the green stuff is used more obviously and more frequently. Clearly, some funding support is going to be necessary over and above these incentives, the tax incentives. There's no escaping the fact that net zero is a cost. The cost overall might be low, but the buildings cost is a big chunk of the cost for the economy, of the order of 15 billion a year. So that is a distributional question that the Treasury also needs to tackle. Question for the Treasury is, how is this transition going to take place in a fair way? How are those costs going to be levied in such that we protect the most vulnerable consumers? And part of the other part of the cost story is unlocking cheap finance. I've mentioned that a few times, but I mentioned before, this is a really capital intensive mission that we have in buildings. As such, that capital should be as cheap as possible, because that's what's going to keep the cost of the economy down, keep the cost of the consumer down. That means having really solid policies from the government that banks can lend against, be confident will be there in perpetuity, and can have some cheap finance against to fuel the transition and make it a quick one and cheap one. Next slide, thanks. Next are the enabling measures. So let's have a better assessment of the overall challenge. That includes things like green building passports, MOTs for houses. That will allow households to have a better real-world understanding of the energy performance of their home. It's the bedrock of a meaningful strategy to upgrade and renovate homes cost effectively. And that assessment really should begin now. So let's get that going. Assessment of the building stock nationally. We will also need stronger compliance for some tougher building standards. We have to stop building crap new homes, as my chairman is famous for saying. But those homes that right now are inexplicably fail to meet even the minimum standards. So we're going to need to see enforcement of better building standards to at least the minimum, and preferably even more than that. And that means more resources for local authorities. And lastly on this, let's just get excited about it. We reckon there is as much as 250,000 new jobs in energy efficiency and decarbonised heat over the next 3 decades. That is huge. We're going to put some analysis around that in December. But that would, if I'm right, that would double the size of the construction sector. And remember, that's a transition that will take place in every region of the UK. So it is a meaningful labour market policy. It will need, therefore, advanced skills and retraining provision to meet that kind of demand. And again, we've got to get prepped for that. This is the kind of thing that we should be doing in the middle of a recession. This is a transition we know we need to make. So let's get excited about the economic opportunity and the jobs opportunity that comes with this. Next slide, thanks. And lastly, getting on with it. We have not got time, to use a technical term, to piss about. So strong action now on those segments that I mentioned earlier, where we know we can get started, off gas grid especially. Strong action to start the assessment and the planning necessary to move to a quicker scale later. I am a big advocate of area-based planning, local area energy plans, as a means to build local consent for the changes that are coming. Let's get that put in place. And the regulator needs to get prepped too. So Ofgem must get ready for the network investment that will be necessary overall to get us to that zero carbon buildings outcome. So the very, very last thing I wanted to say, if we move to the next slide, thank you, is some optimism. And I did want to end on an optimistic note, and I hope this hasn't been too pessimistic, but I really do feel optimistic about what comes next. If you just move to the last slide for me. For too long, we have talked about heat decarbonisation as being too hard or such a big problem. You know, it's often framed that way when we think about climate change. I would like to flip that on its head and encourage you all to see it differently. There is a massive moment coming of exciting change, and I really, really feel we should be able to embrace it. Those who embrace the coming changes are really going to thrive because there is a big market out there to address. I do not know all the answers on heat decarbonisation. Anyone who says they do is telling an untruth. What I do know, though, is that we have to get started. We will learn from the early mistakes if we start trying and if we start making that change. And I just wanted to leave you with this chap who is not Sir Dennis Rooke. This is Andrew Witherall, who is a music hero of mine. I'm afraid Andrew died in January this year, very unexpectedly. He was famed for his sense of timing, so he missed the pandemic quite wisely, I think. Andrew had a motto, which he felt sufficiently strongly about to have tattooed on his forearms, which you can see here. And that motto, if you can't make it out, is "Fail we may, but sail we must," which you can see on each forearm. And I really take that to heart, because when we think about the issues that we've talked about today, that should be our motto. I can think of really nothing better as a way of concluding this particular lecture. So I hope we begin this journey, and I hope we don't fail, but I know we must sail, and I hope you'll join me on that journey. So thank you very much indeed for listening to me tonight.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. We've got a load of questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to fire some really quick questions at you. And I'd like to have to get very quick answers as well. So the first one is the graph of levelised cost of nuclear may be cheaper on a whole system basis. Why are we not using levelised cost? Why are we still using levelised cost, not whole system costs?
So I think it's a really good question, Anthony, and of course I think I would agree with that. I mean, I use levelised cost because it's a conventional way of it. We could also show you that chart that looks at whole system costs. You know, the levelised cost hides within it all sorts of things, and I would quite like to move away from it, but it is nonetheless still the kind of the benchmark. I'm up for that. So I think you will see us use you know, a better expression of the system costs overall.
Okay, thank you. There are certain areas of industry where fossil fuels are still used as process feedstocks as well as energy sources. How do we see it being possible to decarbonise these industries? So we agree, and I don't know, I won't show you my slides again, but there is a slide that shows you that we've still got that in there. So we're looking at a strategy there of using carbon capture alongside it. For some sectors, it will continue to make sense to continue to use those fossil fuels. So you know there may be some residual emissions that we have to offset with removals at the end of this, and again there's room for that. So again that's the strategy that we've just got to see from the government, and industry will then respond. Great, thanks. I like this one from Hillary actually. 2050 is at least 6 general elections away. How can we protect a net zero strategy against disruption by changing governments? Bloody hell. Well, we'll help. And I think, you know, the kind of key thing here is that we've got to get some long-term policies in place. Now, the big success story of the last 15 years has been power sector decarbonisation. That's lasted through several governments of different colours. That's a great model. So, you know, that's built confidence among investors, and you're seeing the benefits of that now. We can do that in other sectors.
And I've talked a lot about hydrogen tonight. That's a sector where you can see the same kind of conditions in place, where you could put in place long-term price support. You could use auctions. You could use the same kind of facilities for carbon capture and storage. Those kind of big, highly centralized energy system questions really benefit from that kind of policy. The atomized policies, the ones I talked about earlier, the 30 million or so homes that we have, we need to look to the tax policies, of course, which I'm afraid do change. But really, I would like to see us move to a world where it is super clear the date by which we need to transition from fossil fuels in each of the sectors. So you're going to get that from us at the end of the year. It's the kind of thing you could stick in an energy white paper. It would benefit immensely from having some legislation and regulation around it.
Excellent, thanks. There's a specific question here around industry processes like ceramics. How can we get the high temperatures that are needed for those particular processes without natural gas? Have you got a view on that, please?
Yeah, so we can use natural gas, and we can do it in places where we can capture the carbon, or we can use hydrogen. There is room though for some point source emissions from fossil fuels in the future too. So it's not that they're completely eliminated, but we still need to. We need broadly a situation where almost all of industry has been fully decarbonised. Again, there is room at the margins in all of these sectors for some continuing emissions.
Yeah, in your you spoke about bringing the public with us. There's a question here from Andy saying folk are very precious about the work in their homes. Swapping out heating systems would be disruptive. How do we factor in the will of the people and the balancing act of politicians to take the most popular route?
Well, I don't have an easy answer to that question. What I do know is that it's not just about politicians, and I think very often we think, oh, it's just politics. I mean, even in this discussion, you could take from it that I think it's all about quasi-quating. It's not. So I think the crucial thing for me is we've got to open up the discussion. Now, I've learned a bit this year about that in the work I did with the Climate Assembly. And it's fascinating, really, really fascinating. These 108 people that I talked about who had completely different views on the issues that I've talked about tonight, on climate itself. Really fabulous. There's a guy called Mark who was one of the Citizen Assembly members who was willing to do some media afterwards, but he's a gas installer. His dad was a miner. He started off, I think, quite resistant to some of these changes, but moved to where he just, he was really passionate about the need to get cracking on it. And I think it's really interesting. It takes a bit of work to bring the information in such a way that we can have an informed discussion about it. But it doesn't take very much once you've done that to reach a point where people generally understand the transition ahead, understand the need for it. But out of that comes some really interesting stuff. Now, that group of people, I happen to believe this would be something that would be replicated with larger groups of people, they really understood all of that and accepted it. What they wanted was the minimum of disruption. So they wanted the options, they wanted a bit of community consent, local consent about what to do, and then they wanted, as much as possible, the minimum of disruption. And they were very supportive of that kind of, so that kind of idea that there is a single intervention, if you can bring that about so that it's not a kind of enduring set of points when someone comes into the home to do something unwanted. I think we're going to have to, there isn't an easy answer to this. We know we've got to do it, but the world is not as it was in the 70s when we envisaged the switch over to natural gas in the North Sea, of course. Now, I think we can do it, but let's get real. We're going to have to start bringing that information into the open. And I think my point generally is that we should not be afraid of that. We should be optimistic about the ability to get to the right outcome at the end of it, and trust people to make the right decisions. It turns out that's what happens. So it's a bit of a slogan, I suppose, but trust the people.
Yeah. So a question here from John. I was wondering why the Imperial study didn't look at hydrogen-driven heat pumps as a pathway option.
There was a limit to what we could look at, but I think you can still draw some conclusions about that as a pathway. Basically, I don't think it would have hugely different system costs if we looked at that. I'm open to suggestion about that, but we've looked at a slightly broader range of things in our hydrogen report, which I would recommend to you in 2018. It drew a lot on that Imperial study, but it did also look at some of the broader options. I think all you should take from this is not me, that I don't have a prescription for how we should fully decarbonise heat. Well, I think what we have is a choice. And interestingly, all of the pathways indicate that they're all in kind of ballpark same cost. We should think more exclusive. We should think more actively about what would suit regions and where there is local consent for those changes, rather than looking at the cost of them. I'm entirely up for a world where we're using hydrogen in that way, for example.
So just picking up on hydrogen for a moment, the next question here is, I don't see any reference to the large amounts of storage that might be needed for hydrogen in the future. And this is on the basis that hydrogen has a third of the calorific value of natural gas.
Yeah, that we have looked at that, and I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but you're right, there would be a need for storage. It's another one of the reasons for thinking that a full hydrogen conversion is unwieldy. But more regional use of hydrogen, we think there is not really a problem with storing it, particularly salt cavern storage. But there is I don't dismiss that as a problem. So it's not a problem we have with natural gas, which is stored, of course, in the network itself. So we have got more information on that in the hydrogen report. I haven't got the stats in front of me, but it's worth looking at.
Okay, thank you. Question from Paul. Large amounts of hydrogen production will also require large amounts of water. How would you reconcile that? Hydrogen production by steam reforming will also require large amounts of water as well.
Yeah, this is a really important interaction with the other side of my role. So we, firstly, let me acknowledge, I think that is entirely correct. And we're running some analysis at the moment, which is looking at the net zero scenarios that we talked about. So some of the scenarios for achieving net zero involve enormous quantities of hydrogen potentially. And one of the constraining factors is water availability. And of course, there is a link then with the changes in climate themselves. So we know that drought is going to be more of an issue by mid-century, and we're by the end of the year, I hope we'll be able to present to you a net zero strategy that accommodates those changes in water availability, so that we can demonstrate to you that there will be enough water and enough power available to supply the amount of hydrogen that we are including in our pathway for the sixth carbon budget.
Okay, thank you. Does the price shift that CCC is suggesting mean that electricity would be subsidised by gas by means of differentiated VAT?
So we're not saying that. I mean, I think that is an option, but it's definitely not one that we're recommending here. What we're saying is that there is certainly an imbalance, and that is something that in the Treasury's review of net zero they need to look at. We could make electricity cheaper alongside the gas. That would be a credible way through it. Of course, there's an impact on the exchequer for that, but of course that would fit better with the fuel poverty objectives that the government has too. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question though. We know that overall, if we're going to get to net zero, we need to start thinking about applying a higher carbon price in the future. That is the Treasury's own approach. And when it comes to domestic gas, it is cheaper than electricity, so it is an inbuilt penalty. I mean, even still, it's still quite appealing to use electricity for the purposes of heat. So I mean, I think we are talking about not big changes, but it's almost there's a kind of omerta to talk about it at all. And I really do think it's one of the strategic issues that will have to be looked at by the Chancellor when he does his review of how net zero will be funded. He's publishing that in the spring. Looks like that will be part of the now delayed budget. So I think that's one to watch.
Excellent, thank you. Right, two more quick questions and then we'll draw this Q&A to a close. Why have successive governments over the past 10 to 20 years been reluctant to amend the building regulations?
Because they're feared, as we would say in these parts. I mean, I think there's the two things going on. One is that it's not a very it's not seen as a very dynamic area for ministers to focus on, and there's quite a loud vocal lobby against changes. Of course, the industries build up around those standards. The other thing here is I think that the trade of building standards, the people who set those policies don't see themselves as driving change. So I think you get that kind of I think you can it's a double issue overall, and I really think we've got to crack that. I mean. Building standards are really interesting, and the Future Home Standard is going to set quite an interesting precedent actually for driving change. I would look to Germany, which has a more active policy towards building standards. They also, incidentally, and this is an anecdote, but my understanding is that they have a policy of exporting German building standards to other countries. So you might find, for example, the Brazilian building code looks very similar to the German building code, and that's because that's a tool of trade policy. So I would like to see ministers think more creatively about how they could use building standards as a means to change. We will need those kind of changes to get to net zero, but it actually is quite exciting. You know, creating tougher standards is a way of building new markets. And I think that is part of the story here. You know, we can be excited about those standards and the market that's needed to address them.
So last one then, let's finish on a high. You said you were excited about hybrid heat. Climate Change Assembly said they wanted a minimum amount of disruption. Have you seen the new packed hybrids that are being trialled by UKPN and Wales and West Utilities that fit in a standard boiler casing?
So I have, because I'm a geek on it, but I'm not sure anyone else would think that they were excited. But yes, I mean, it's not that, you know, we can do this. And I think it's that kind of progress that will really drive people to feel much better about this. Instead of worrying about it as a problem, let's think about it as a challenge. That's what Sir Dennis Rooke would have done, I suspect. So now is the moment for us to really kind of to bite down properly on this and get cracking. I think the decade ahead is really what's going to define whether we're successful or not. And it's those things that I do get excited about. Others should too.
I'd completely agree, Chris. So on behalf of IGEM, thank you so much for your presentation to us tonight. Thanks for taking the Q&A. There was a load more there. Apologies, we haven't been able to do all of them. I think you've brought out some fantastic points, particularly around the sense of urgency, particularly about the sense of, you know, this is an opportunity we've got ahead of us. So let's seize it and let's take it. So once again, thank you very much. And at this point, I will hand back to Neil for just a closing thought.
Yes, thank you, Tony. And my sincere thanks too, on behalf of everybody, to Chris Stark for what was clearly such a timely and informative lecture, in which we were really privileged to receive such a volume of previously unpublished material. So thanks for that, Chris. Really, really appreciated. So as we close, I'm pleased to announce that the Sir Dennis Rooke Memorial Lecture 2021 will take place on Wednesday, the 24th of March, and will be delivered by Lord Brown of Madingley. John Brown, of course, served BP as its chief exec from 1995 to 2007. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, given yesterday's coronavirus-related announcements, final details of Lord Brown's presentation will be confirmed with you at a later time. But for now, lock the date, Wednesday the 24th of March, into your diaries. So thank you, enjoy the rest of your evening, and stay safe.